Well, I can find the 14, so we'll do that. Actually, 14 turns out to be the right. See, it's too tight on her at the waist, which is good. Let's take a look at your back and your underarms. Now, once again, she might end up letting this out a little bit. However, we are fitting her over her Levi's, and the boning will take out some of those. However, I do think it might be better to just let this out. This looks fine. It looks like it's fine under here. Let's see if it's tall enough, and it is. See, it's over her bust there, so that when she laces in, it'll be the right size. Actually, you know what I'd rather do? You see, the 14 is really too small for her in the bust, and this is the D size. So what I'd rather have her do is cut the 16. That means, and take in the rest of it, and that would be better. So when you cut your corset, cut the 16 at the top, cut the 14 at the bottom, and then blend the lines. Later in the video, I'll be telling you how to do that. So you're 16 on top, 14 on bottom. And no other alterations, I think, would be necessary. There you go. I'm going to do 14 on you too, I think. Yeah. Okay. Too big. See how I can just draw that in? So use a 12. There we go. Now, let's settle this on your waist. Is that your waist? Yeah. Okay. Now she's, you know what? This is still too big for you. Let's try 10. We may go back to the 12 and take it in, because the 10 may be too short, but we're going to try this one. Kind of like that. Now this lady's going to be able to draw in her waist quite a bit. I can feel that. Now see, this is what I was afraid of. The 10 is her size, but it's much, much too short. And I think it's going to be okay. So what I want you to do on this one, now it fits her okay under the arms and in the back, but in the front, it's much too short. So I'm going to say she cuts the 10D and lengthens just the front an inch. You can always take it up 3/4 of an inch. You can always cut it off later. Let me write that down. Half the time I forget what I've just said. 10D. There you go. You're welcome. Okay. Now, technically, Marianne is outside the measurements of the corset. However, let's take a look at this largest size, and we'll talk about how she could maybe modify it to fit her better. Now, this is the 20. Hi, Marianne. Hi. This is the 26D. Let me get that. I've got it folded up in the back. There we go. And let's see how much of a squish factor Marianne has. Oh, pretty good. So although her measurements, her natural body measurements are out, that's not your waist. Let me get it down further. But now, is that your waist?
Yeah, that's my waist.
Okay. Though her body measurements...
Actually, my waist is just a tad lower.
Okay, let's see. That's what you tell... your models have to tell you where the waist is. You can't guess. Now, your corset's going to make a waist for you, whether you think you've, a little bit of that, whether you think you've got it there or not. So let's take a look. This is the 26D on Marianne, and although technically she's outside the size range, actually the 26D, because of the squish factor, would fit her, but with lots of alterations, and that's what we talked about before with Marianne. The waist fits, but she's much curvier here. She's going to cut out the 26D, the waist will fit, but she's going to have to let all these seams out as far as they'll go. And the front doesn't look too bad, actually. I would say 26D, but let the back out severely. And Marianne will need additional fitting in the next steps. And I want you to let out the back. From waist to hip. If you can read that writing, you're better than me. Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you.
Tianne made a corset in one of my workshops, and I think it looks absolutely lovely. The problem being is it's too high in the back for her. Now, if I would look at this, I would say that's fine. But Tianne is a dancer, and if she's not comfortable in her corset, it doesn't matter what I think. So what we would do here, it's just uncomfortable for her. So what I would do, no, I won't manhandle you, is I would go ahead, take the binding off the top, rather than make a whole new corset. I mean, you may want to, but take the binding off the top, remove the bones, and cut it down until, and keep trying it on, just cut it off until you're comfortable. And then, of course, you have to deal with the grommets, because you'll have to cut some of those off, and then you'll just have to, it'll be a little bit unsightly. You'll have to bind it back up the best you can, use fray check or whatever. But that is what I would do. That would be so much easier than making a whole new corset. And then you swap out the bones for the new size bones. Just take those out and keep trying on your corset until it's comfortable, until you can dance in it. And that's what I would do instead of making a whole new corset. As I say, it'll look a little funky right here, but much easier. And I'll swap those bones for the right size.
Okay.
You look beautiful. There's one thing I want to interject here before you cut your fitting muslin. Sometimes even experienced sewers forget that you don't line up cut edges when you go to sew to the corset together. You line up notches and sewing lines. So you can see that it matches at 5/8 inch away, but it would not match if you lined up cut edges. So it's just a reminder. You heard me give alterations advice to our fitting models. And here's what I mean by that. Obviously, when I tell them extend just the front, you don't want to extend the whole corset. So on the doré, I've shown a 1-inch extension. What you do is extend here on piece 1, 2, or 6, 7, 8, 9, an inch, and then taper. This is where it goes underneath your arm. And you want to taper to nothing. So unfortunately, it's happened that I've said extend the front, and they would extend only one piece. You need to extend this, and then taper it to nothing. This is on the doré. And one of the gals you saw, I needed to lengthen the whole corset. And this is how you do that. You cut it on the lengthen, shorten lines, and you spread it apart, tape some paper under there, and then you've lengthened the whole corset 1 inch. The opposite would be if you're going to shorten the corset. Wendy had a corset, I said you should shorten the whole corset 3/4 of an inch. In that case, you would cut it and overlap it 3/4 of an inch. And this is what the alterations would look like on the Silverado. And you've got to lengthen, if you're just going to lengthen just the front, you lengthen all these pieces, 11, 12, 13, taper it to nothing where it goes underneath the arm, and you also have to remember to lengthen your bust gores. If you lengthen the whole corset, you don't have to lengthen the bust gores. You merely split it at the lengthen shorten line and add the required inch. Now you're ready to actually cut your corset and start sewing. You'll need to cut 2 of the corset fabric and 2 of lining. Oh, I wanted to go back and talk about this. After you cut the corset, make sure you mark your notches, because it's going to keep you straight on whether all these little pieces you can imagine, it's easy to get them twisted. You can also put an X on the wrong side of the fabric so that when you pick them up to sew them, you know immediately whether you've got the right side or the wrong side. Now, you can also mark the boning channels. The pattern has suggested additional boning channels on it. Those are just suggestions. You can mark them if you like, or in a future step, I'll show you how you pick and choose and draw in boning channels of your own choice. In any case, you mark the boning channels only on the lining. Now, I'm not going to be doing any physical sewing of the corset, and the reason for that is it's simply not necessary. The sewing of a corset is absolutely simple, straightforward. If you're a non-sewer or a beginning sewer, you'll need help in the sewing step. It's beyond the scope of this video to actually teach you to sew as well. But I will say a few things about actually sewing it. Use a size 14 or 16-inch needle. These are a little bit bigger. They'll withstand the thickness of the coutil, and if you mistakenly hit the busk or a bone while you're sewing, it will help to keep it from breaking. You might break some needles if you get too close to your bone, so be very careful. Use a regular stitch length, which is about 12 per inch. I had a student who said, I have a problem with my corsets ripping, so I'm going to use a little tiny stitch length. Sure enough, she sewed two things together that were wrong, and she spent the next hour ripping it. It's really not necessary. If your corsets are ripping, it's probably not your stitch length. Just use a regular one. This you will not get away with. You must make sure your tension is correct. I've seen it over and over in my classes. They bring a machine that's their friend's, or it's old, or they haven't used it in a while, and they've got the tension wrong, and so you've got a loopy stitch. The minute you put your corset on, it will stretch, and so you won't get away with that. So get your tension fixed before you start to sew your corset. So let's go into the actual steps of sewing your corset now that you've got it cut out. And you would follow the cutting instructions that come in the pattern as far as the layout goes. Step number 1. If you wish to do any decorative embroidery outside of flossing is the last thing you do, but if we're doing decorative embroidery like this is very difficult to do on a corset that's finished. You can see that I've done a lot of that on the bust gores and down the front of this one. So you want to do that first before you start to sew, and you might want to fuse the back of these pieces so that the embroidery does not pucker. And this gives you a chance to use those fancy stitches that you've never used before. This is somewhat of a key that I have of a few of the ones that I have, and I take a look at these and choose if there's one that I want to use. So the first thing you do is embroider. Also, let's say, despite all my encouragement to use a very strong fabric, you just really want a pretty corset, and you want this thin material on the outside. This happens to be poly, but it could be anything, silk, whatever. Well, you can do that, but you have to flatline. And what that means is you've got to give it some body that it doesn't have. Let's say further, you want to put lace on the outside. What you do is you sandwich your weak fabrics with a coutil, and you sew it all the way around the outside. Now this is called flatlining, and you do this first before you even begin to sew. You will also have a lining, so you treat this as one piece. This is the outside of your corset now. And here's another example of the kinds of embroidery that you can do on the bust gores and down the front. The first thing you're going to do, or when you start to sew, is to insert your busk. And we're going to do the right side first. So the first thing you do is find this. This is the hook side of your busk, what I call the hook side. And you want to know which is the top. The top of your busk is like this. And if you're confused, you can actually write on it that I have. Top, outside. You can insert this upside down and backwards. And what you want to do is, if you look at this, this is the side that goes on the right-hand side of your body. The hook's set on top of the steel. This is the piece you want, and this is the way you want it oriented. Here's a 12, and here's a 13, and this is the direction that they go. So you get that. And then look amongst your pattern pieces and find the piece of coutil that is meant for the right-hand side of your body. I actually hold it up to me to make sure I've got it right and I'm not doing something dyslexic. This is what the Doré would look like, and this is what the Silverado would look like. So make sure you've got these appropriate pieces and the lining that goes with them. I've used a white lining so you can see it. Now the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to take that busk and you're going to line it up. But what you do is take these pieces that were, this is right side out. Now you want to put your lining and your coutil together with right sides together because we're going to start to sew. And that's how we sew, always is with right sides together generally. You're going to take your busk, you know where's the top, and you're going to line it up on at the center front. And we're going to need to take a closer look at this later, but I'm going to line it up. I'm going to describe it to you first. Put your busk 3/4 inch from the top and 5/8 inch away from the cut edge. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit too much below here. If there's too much, you can close that with a hook and eye. But you can see, if I go, since they come in inch increments, if I go to the 13 from the 12, it's much too long. So this is the correct size for this corset. You're going to lie this down and line up your busk. And on the lining, you're going to take a marking pin, and starting from the top, you're going to make a mark 5/8 inch, and you're going to stop where that hook is. You're going to go back down, make another line, stop where the next one is, and continue on down to all the way to the bottom of the corset. So when you're finished and you've got it pinned together, it looks like this. Same thing with the Silverado, and it will look like this. You see those gaps in the sewing lines. And I've made X's on the wrong side of my fabric, so I know I've got right sides together. Now you're going to take that marking line and you're going to sew on it. And make sure you backstitch. Backstitch, sew, stop, backstitch. Backstitch, sew, stop, backstitch. Basically, you're sewing top to bottom, but leaving holes where your hooks are going to go through. I'm going to get my pins. Now, you're going to turn this and give it a nice hard press. And now you're going to insert your busk on the right side. Now this is kind of hard to do. It crawls around a little bit, so that's why you want to have your pins nearby. You push the first one through the hole and pin it. And you just basically go down and insert the busk that way in the holes that you've created for the busk. It really wants to squirm out, so that's the reason for the pins. And do that all the way down. Once it's in and pinned, you're going to stitch it in. You need to use a zipper foot for this because you're going to go right next to the busk. You want to sew from the bottom all the way around to the top. This sewing anchors the busk so it can't move this way and it can't move that way. And you've inserted the right hand side of your busk. You're going to use this on the next step. Now obviously we're going to do the left hand side. So once again, locate the pattern pieces that belong on the left hand side of your body. This is the Silverado, this is the Doré. And as opposed to that, where you stopped sewing, you're going to sew these straight from the top to the bottom. And then you're going to turn them and give them a hard press. This is what they'll look like, left hand side. Then you'll take the busk that you inserted in the previous step and line it up with the left-hand side. You line the right-hand side up with the left-hand side. The tops should meet and the bottom should meet, and the two centers should come right together. And I'm going to lay it down here just like that. And what you do now is you take a marking pen, and in the furthest that you can, in the holes in the hooks, you're going to make a mark. Just one mark all the way down. So then you locate the post side. Once again, I call it the post side. Some of the people call it different things. You want to know which is the top and which is the bottom. You can insert busks upside down and backwards, and they will work, but not as well. And you know it's the correct side because the post is closest on this side. You're going to insert this right under the fabric where you've made your holes. And this is where we're going to push the posts through. And you just push them through the top of the fabric. You don't have to worry about the seam allowance. The seam allowance can lie flat. And you're going to take your awl again. And you're going to make a hole right where you've made your mark. And then just pop the post through it. It's very easy to do. Here's a hole I've made already. And I just work my post through it. And there you have it. Do that all the way down. And like the previous step, you want to anchor this in. You pin that in so it doesn't move around. And you sew all the way from the top around the side to the bottom using zipper foot. So once again, this doesn't go this way and it doesn't go this way and disappear. So, step one completed, you've inserted your busk. So set that aside for now. Now we're going to go down the back, do the back. This is what it'll look like. And unlike the busk in front, you're going to do the same thing to both sides of the back. And you can see that there's a straight line at the center back. That's how you can locate it. This is what the doré would look like in the back. The Silverado is somewhat similar. So find these pieces and the lining that goes with them. Sew them together, right sides together, and then turn them. This is the one place in the whole corset where I would suggest that you trim the seam allowance. I've made them all, or both ways. Trimming seam allowances, clipping and not, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. And I've come to leaving the seam allowances in, just as they are, and pressing them open. But this is the one place where I would suggest trimming the seam allowance so it doesn't interfere with your grommets. So you turn that and give it a hard press. And starting from the top, let me talk about the boning channels first, sorry. The first thing you're going to do is sew the boning channels. A boning channel is stitching lines 3/8 inch away that's big enough to insert a bone through. And that's what holds your bones in place. So the way you do it in the back is the first line of stitching is 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, your folded edge. Then you're going to want to leave some room for your grommets. It should be 5/8 of an inch for 0/0 or 3/4 for the really big grommets. That'll leave a space. And make another stitching line, 5/8 inch away. And then further, another 3/8 inch away, another line. So you've made a line at 3/8, an additional 5/8 and 3/8. This gives you two boning channels that goes around your grommets. Without bones around your grommets, when you draw in your corset, it would collapse like a drawstring purse. Once you've stitched your boning channels, go down an inch from the top and make a mark. And then make a mark every 3/4 of an inch until you get to the bottom. The bottom doesn't matter so much. You can leave about an inch there with no grommet. It won't matter. And then do the same to both sides. And then look at them and match them up and make sure you haven't made a mistake in measurement. And then you insert your grommets. And here I can show you the size 0 grommets that I prefer. They come in brass, black, and nickel. But you just go ahead and insert your grommets as I demonstrated previously in the video. And once you've done that, set that aside. Now I'm going to talk about inserting the bust gores. Not every corset has bust gores, but if yours does, this is the time to do it. This is the earliest type of bust gore insertion. They merely slashed the fabric and inserted the gore. This is very difficult to do because basically your seam allowance is 1/8 of an inch and you must worry about pivoting at the bottom and sewing it. It's very difficult. I can show you completed. This is how it looks when it's been sewn in. The problem, it's very weak here because the seam allowance is basically nothing at the bottom. So what you do there is some decorative embroidery, some reinforcement so that it doesn't pull out. Also, when you look at your bust gore, whatever pattern you're using, make sure the bust gore looks like this, more of a petal shape. If it's a triangle, it will be very ill-fitting. So you need to make sure it looks like that. The Silverado does not do it that way. I've got lots of seam allowances, so it's easier to sew. So here are the steps, and I've marked them. The first thing you want to do is find piece 11. Then you sew your bust gore from top to 5/8 inch below it. You sew piece 12, the bust gore to the bottom, and then you sew pull the bust gore out of the way and sew all the way to the bottom. Repeat for here, and here I can show you the bust gore is sewn from here to the 5/8. So the next step would be to sew